The desert wind carried more than dust through Silver Rock that August afternoon. It carried the weight of unspoken histories, the ghosts of men who died with their boots on, and the peculiar scent of sage mixed with desperation that seemed to cling to every soul who'd wandered too far from civilization. John McAllister stood at the edge of town, watching the heat shimmer off the packed earth road that stretched endlessly toward nowhere. At 38, he'd already lived more lives than most men cavalry soldier, widower, and now just another shadow haunting the borderlands between memory and forgetting. His weathered face bore the map of those years, a scar above his left eyebrow from Antietam. Crow's feet earned from squinting across too many horizons, and that particular hollow look in gray eyes that spoke of having seen too much. Silver Rock wasn't much to look at, never had been, never would be. A collection of sun-bleached wooden buildings huddled together like old men sharing secrets, their facades peeling and warped from the relentless assault of desert weather. The town boasted one general store, a blacksmith whose hammer rang out the hours better than any church bell, a hotel that doubled as a brothel when the proprietor thought nobody was watching, and Big Tom's Saloon, the only establishment that never closed and never ran dry. John adjusted his hat against the afternoon glare and headed for Big Tom's. Not because he was particularly thirsty, but because solitude had a way of growing teeth when the sun started its descent toward the mountains. The saloon's bat-wing doors creaked their familiar greeting as he pushed through, the sudden dimness a mercy after the blazing light outside. The usual crowd populated the scarred wooden tables, prospectors still clinging to dreams of gold. Cowboys between cattle drives, drifters who'd forgotten where they were drifting to, and the town's permanent fixtures who'd long ago traded ambition for the comfort of routine. Big Tom himself, a mountain of a man with arms like ham hocks and a mustache that could house a family of mice, nodded from behind the bar. McAllister. He grunted, already reaching for the whiskey bottle. The usual. Just beer today. Tom. John found his customary spot at the bar's far end, where he could keep his back to the wall and an eye on both entrances, old habits from his cavalry days that refused to die. That's when she walked in. The conversation in the saloon didn't exactly stop, but it stuttered, like a heart missing a beat. She stood in the doorway for a moment, silhouetted against the harsh light outside, and John could see even from across the room that something was terribly wrong. Her dress, which might once have been a respectable blue calico, hung in tatters. Red dust caked her from head to toe, turning her blonde hair the color of dried blood. But it was her eyes that made John's hand instinctively move toward the Colt .45 at his hip, wild. Desperate eyes that darted around the room like a trapped animal seeking escape. She swayed slightly, one hand gripping the doorframe for support, and John could see the telltale tremor of exhaustion in her limbs. How long had she been walking? Where had she come from? The nearest settlement was Carson's Bend, 2 days' ride through some of the most unforgiving country God ever saw fit to create. Well, well, a voice drawled from one of the corner tables. What have we here? Rusty Kane unfolded himself from his chair like a snake preparing to strike. Everything about the man suggested violence barely contained, from the pair of matched Remingtons worn low on his hips to the scar that twisted his mouth into a permanent sneer. He led a group of 5 men who made their living in that gray area between cattle driving and cattle stealing, depending on who was asking and how much they were paying. Looks like a little lost dove, Rusty continued, his spurs jangling as he approached the woman. You lost, darlin'. Or maybe you're looking for work. Big Tom runs a clean establishment, but I'm sure arrangements could be made. The woman's jaw tightened, and she straightened despite her obvious exhaustion. I need water, she said, her voice hoarse, but carrying an undertone of steel. And food. I can pay. Can you now? Rusty circled her slowly, his men grinning and elbowing each other. Funny thing about payment, sometimes it ain't about money. John watched the scene unfold, his jaw clenching. Stay out of it, the voice of self-preservation whispered. You've got no stake in this. But something about the woman, maybe the defiant tilt of her chin despite her circumstances, or the way her fingers trembled not with fear, but with rage, stirred something in him he'd thought long buried. "The lady said she can pay," John heard himself say, his voice cutting through the saloon's tense atmosphere like a blade through silk. "That's good enough for Big Tom's, isn't it, Tom?" Every head in the saloon swiveled toward him. Rusty's eyes narrowed, taking in John's measure the worn but well-maintained clothes, the Colt sitting easy in its holster, the cavalry bearing that 10 years of civilian life hadn't quite erased. "This ain't your concern, McAllister," Rusty said, his hand drifting toward his guns. "Man should mind his own business in a town like this." "Funny thing about business," John replied, not moving from his spot at the bar but shifting his weight slightly, clearing his gun hand. "Sometimes a man's business is making sure ladies get treated with proper respect. Something about civilization and all that." The saloon held its collective breath. Violence in Big Tom's wasn't uncommon, but it was usually the sloppy, drunken kind that ended with broken furniture and bruised egos. This had the feel of something more permanent. Big Tom's meaty hand appeared on the bar, casually polishing a glass while his other hand rested on the scattergun he kept beneath the counter. "Now, boys," he rumbled. "Seems to me the ladies made a simple request. Water and food for payment. That's what I call good business." Rusty's scar darkened as blood rushed to his face. For a long moment, John thought he might go for his guns anyway. Then one of his men, a weaselly fellow with nervous eyes, tugged at his sleeve. "Boss," he whispered urgently, "that there's John McAllister. You know, from the war. They say he—" "I know who he is," Rusty snarled, but something in his posture shifted. The moment of maximum danger passed like a thundercloud deciding to save its lightning for another day. "This ain't over, McAllister. A man can't hide behind his reputation forever." "Not hiding," John said mildly, "just drinking my beer." Rusty spat on the floor, a calculated insult that would have demanded response in other circumstances, and jerked his head at his men. They filed out, their spurs creating a discordant symphony against the floorboards. At the door, Rusty turned back, his eyes finding not John but the woman. "I'll be seeing you again, darlin'. Silver Rock's a small town, real small." When the Batwing door stopped swinging, the saloon exhaled collectively. Conversations resumed in hushed tones, everyone pretending they weren't stealing glances at the woman and John. "Ma'am," Big Tom said, his voice gentle as a mountain avalanche could be gentle. "Why don't you take a seat, Mary?" he bellowed toward the back. "Bring some water and whatever's left of that stew." The woman's legs gave out as soon as she reached a chair, and John found himself moving before conscious thought engaged. He caught her arm, steadying her, and felt the tremors running through her frame like telegraph wires carrying desperate messages. "Thank you," she whispered, and up close. John could see past the dust and exhaustion to the woman underneath. She was younger than he'd first thought, maybe 30, with fine features that spoke of education and breeding. Whatever had driven her to walk through the desert alone had been worse than the considerable dangers of the journey itself. "John McAllister," he said, releasing her arm once she was settled. "Eliza," she replied, then hesitated before adding, "Eliza Harrow." Mary, Big Tom's daughter and the closest thing Silver Rock had to an angel of mercy, appeared with water and a bowl of stew that smelled better than it probably was. Eliza drank the water in long, desperate gulps, then forced herself to eat slowly despite her obvious hunger. John returned to the bar but positioned himself where he could watch both Eliza and the door. Old habits again. Big Tom poured him a whiskey despite his earlier request for beer. "Trouble's coming," Tom said quietly. "Rusty Kane don't forget a slight. And that woman—" he shook his massive head. "She's running from something. You can see it in her eyes." "Not my problem," John said automatically, but the words tasted like ashes. Tom snorted. Sure it ain't. That's why you just faced down 5 armed men for a stranger. Would have done the same for anyone. No, Tom said with surprising insight. You wouldn't have. John had no answer for that, so he focused on his whiskey and tried not to watch Eliza from the corner of his eye. She ate methodically, mechanically, like a soldier fueling up for a long march. When she finished, she reached into a hidden pocket in a ruined dress and pulled out several coins. Gold coins. John noticed with surprise. Is there a room available? She asked Mary. And perhaps a bath? Of course, dear, Mary said, her motherly instincts fully engaged. Come on, let's get you cleaned up. As the 2 women headed for the stairs, Eliza paused and looked back at John. Mr. McAllister, thank you, again. He touched the brim of his hat. Welcome to Silver Rock, Mrs. Harrow. Something flickered across her face at the title pane, maybe, or anger, but she merely nodded and followed Mary upstairs. John lingered over his whiskey as the afternoon crowd gave way to the evening shift. Miners coming off work. Cowboys looking to wash trail dust from their throats. The usual collection of hard men living hard lives. But his thoughts kept circling back to Eliza Harrow and those gold coins. A woman traveling alone through the desert was unusual. A woman traveling alone with gold was unheard of. And despite her educated bearing, those hadn't been Eastern coins. They were the kind miners used, or the kind that changed hands in transactions best conducted away from the law's prying eyes. You're thinking too hard, Big Tom observed, refilling John's glass. It'll give you wrinkles. Already got those. More wrinkles than... Tom leaned on the bar, his massive frame making the wood creak. She's trouble. John, you know it, I know it, and sure as hell Rusty Kane knows it. Question is, what kind of trouble? Before John could answer, the saloon doors banged open. A stranger stood there, lean, dusty, with the predatory look of a man who made his living hunting other men. His eyes swept the room professionally before settling on Big Tom. Looking for someone, he announced, producing a folded paper from his vest. Woman. About 30, blonde hair, blue eyes. Goes by the name Elizabeth Morrison, but might be using an alias. He unfolded the paper, revealing a wanted poster. $800 for information leading to her capture. She's wanted for theft and murder back in Kansas. The saloon went quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, the kind that preceded storms. John didn't need to see the poster clearly to know whose face would be on it. He kept his expression neutral, just another disinterested drinker, while his mind raced. Ain't seen nobody like that, Big Tom said after a suitable pause. This is a respectable establishment. We don't cater to desperados. The bounty hunter's smile was thin as a razor. Respectable, right. He tacked the poster to the wall near the door. Well, if anyone's memory improves, I'll be in town for a few days. Name's Jake Thornton, professional manhunter. His emphasis on the last word made it clear he didn't much care about the gender of his prey. After Thornton left, conversation resumed in urgent whispers. John stared at the poster from across the room. Even from this distance, he could make out Eliza's features rendered in crude black ink. Wanted for murder, screamed across the top in letters designed to catch the eye and hold it. Well, Big Tom said philosophically, that explains the gold coins. John finished his whiskey in one burning swallow and stood. $800 was more money than most men in Silver Rock would see in 5 years. By morning, everyone in town would know about Eliza Harrow or Elizabeth Morrison, or whoever she really was. And Rusty Kane, nursing his wounded pride and always eager for easy money, would be first in line to collect. The smart play was to walk away, go back to his small ranch outside town, tend his few cattle, and pretend this afternoon had never happened. He'd built a life on not getting involved, on letting the world's troubles flow around him like water around a stone. But as he stepped out into the cooling evening air, John found himself looking up at the hotel's second floor, where lamplight glowed behind one curtained window. Somewhere up there, Eliza Harrow was washing away the desert's touch, probably thinking she'd found temporary sanctuary. She was wrong. Come morning, Silver Rock would turn from refuge to trap, and $800 would make even good men consider doing bad things. John had seen it before, how quickly civilization's mask could slip when survival or greed entered the equation. He should go home. Should forget the defiance in her eyes, the steel in her spine despite exhaustion that would have felled a lesser person. Should forget how she'd said his name like it was a prayer of gratitude. Instead, John McAllister, who'd spent 10 years perfecting the art of not caring, found himself walking toward the hotel's entrance, because sometimes a man's past had a way of catching up with him in unexpected ways. And sometimes the only choice was between the smart thing and the right thing. And John had done enough smart things to last a lifetime. The morning sun painted Silver Rock in shades of gold and shadow as John climbed the hotel's narrow stairs. He'd spent a sleepless night wrestling with decisions that seemed to have already made themselves. The wanted poster's ink might as well have been written in blood for all the trouble it promised. He knocked on the door Mary had indicated, room 7, end of the hall. The footsteps inside paused, then approached cautiously. "Who is it?" Eliza's voice, stronger now, but edged with wariness. "John McAllister. Ma'am, we need to talk." A long silence, then the scrape of a chair being moved from against the door. She opened it a crack, and John caught a glimpse of blue eyes that had lost none of their desperation despite a night's rest and clean clothes. "May I come in? What I have to say shouldn't be discussed in hallways." She studied him for a moment before stepping aside. The room was sparse, but clean, a bed with an iron frame, a washstand, one chair, and a window overlooking the main street. Eliza had changed into a simple brown dress that Mary must have found for her, and with her hair clean and pinned up. She looked more like a schoolteacher than a fugitive. "There's a wanted poster downstairs," John said without preamble. $800. A bounty hunter named Thornton is already in town, and by now everyone knows about it. Eliza sank onto the bed's edge, her composure cracking like poorly mixed adobe in the sun. "I see. Well, I suppose it was foolish to hope I'd outrun it. Want to tell me what really happened in Kansas?" Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Would it matter once there's a price on your head? Truth becomes whatever men want it to be." "Try me." She looked up at him then, something shifting in her expression. "Why? Why do you care what happens to a stranger? A wanted stranger. At that." John moved to the window, checking the street below out of habit. 2 men loitered near the general store, trying to look casual and failing. "Maybe I don't like seeing women hunted like animals. Maybe I've got my own reasons for distrusting wanted posters. Or maybe I'm just a fool who can't mind his own business." "The third option seems most likely," Eliza said, but there was a trace of warmth in it. She took a deep breath. "Very well. My late husband, James Morrison, came from a powerful family in Topeka. Railroad money, cattle interests, fingers in every pie from here to Chicago. When he died of fever last spring, I thought I'd mourn him properly and move on with my life, but his family had other ideas." She stood, pacing to the washstand and back, her words coming faster now. "You see, James had changed his will shortly before his death, leaving everything to me instead of his brothers. They couldn't accept it, a woman, an outsider, inheriting what they considered theirs by right. First came the lawyers, then the threats, then—" She touched her side unconsciously, and John noticed how she favored it slightly. "They locked you up in their ranch outside Topeka, for my own protection," they said. Grief had clearly driven me mad, making me susceptible to fortune hunters and confidence men. They had a doctor bought and paid for, ready to swear to my mental instability. All I had to do was sign papers turning everything over to them, and they'd see I was cared for in an appropriate facility. John had heard similar stories before. The law could be twisted into strange shapes when enough money greased the wheels. But you ran instead. After 2 months of being a prisoner in all but name. Her chin lifted with that defiance he'd noticed before. I took what was mine by right gold from James's safe. Money he'd set aside for our future and left in the night. They're calling it theft, of course. And as for the murder charge. She met his eyes steadily. Tom Morrison, James's youngest brother. He tried to stop me from leaving. We struggled. He fell down the stairs and broke his neck. An accident. But who would believe me? The house staff, someone must have seen. All Morrison employees, dependent on the family for their livelihood. Their stories would match whatever the family wanted them to say. She returned to the bed, suddenly looking exhausted again. So I ran, took what money I could carry and headed west. I thought maybe California or Oregon, somewhere far enough that the Morrison name carried no weight, but they're more determined than I expected. John absorbed this, fitting pieces together like a puzzle. It had the ring of truth, not the polished truth of a practiced liar, but the messy, complicated truth of real life. That bounty hunter, Thornton, he's not the only one who'll come. $800 will bring every gun for hire and desperate man within 100 miles. Then I'll keep running. But even as she said it, exhaustion flickered across her features. How long could anyone run before the desert? The hunters, or simple bad luck caught up. A commotion in the street drew John back to the window. Rusty Kane and his men had gathered outside the saloon, and even from here, John could see Thornton talking to them, gesturing toward the hotel. Money was already changing hands. "Get your things together," John said abruptly. "We're leaving." We, Eliza stood slowly. "Mr. McAllister, you've been more than kind, but this isn't your fight. I won't have another death on my conscience. Nobody's dying on my watch." He moved to the door, checking the hallway. And it became my fight the moment I stood up in that saloon. Rusty Kane's got a long memory and a short temper. He'll come for both of us now. But where can we go? They'll watch the roads. My ranch. It's not much, but it's defensible. And it'll buy us time to think. He turned back to her. Unless you'd prefer to wait here for them to come. Through the window, they could see Thornton pointing up at the hotel. Rusty nodding along with a grin that promised violence. Eliza grabbed a small carpet bag, apparently her only possession besides the clothes Mary had given her. "I don't even know why you're doing this," she said softly. "Neither do I," John admitted. "But I learned a long time ago that sometimes you don't need to understand a thing to know it's right." They slipped out through the hotel's back entrance, where John had left his horse. The mare, a steady bay named Sage, accepted Eliza's weight behind the saddle without complaint. They walked the horse slowly through the back alleys, keeping to shadows. But Silver Rock was too small for true stealth. "McAllister!" The shout came from behind them. Rusty Kane stood at the mouth of an alley, his hand hovering near his gun. "Heard you were harboring fugitives now? That true?" "Just giving a lady a ride," John replied calmly, though his muscles tensed for action. "Last I checked, that wasn't a crime." "It is when there's $800 on her head." Rusty's companions spread out, blocking retreat. "Be smart. John, you had your moment yesterday, playing the hero, but this is business now. Just ride away and let us handle things." "Can't do that, Rusty. Pride's gonna get you killed one day." "Maybe, but not today." The standoff stretched taut as piano wire. Then Eliza shifted behind him, and John felt the cold press of metal against his ribs. She'd drawn a small derringer from somewhere. "Gentlemen," she said, her schoolteacher's voice carrying surprising authority. "I have 2 shots in this gun and nothing left to lose. The first man who draws gets the first bullet. Mr. McAllister gets the second if he tries to stop me. Now back away." Even Rusty looked uncertain. A desperate woman with a gun was unpredictable, dangerous in ways that transcended normal violence. John felt her hand trembling against his back, but her voice remained steady. "You're bluffing," one of Rusty's men said, but he didn't sound convinced. "Tom Morrison thought that too," Eliza replied coldly. "He was wrong." That decided it. The men backed away slowly, and John guided Sage forward, every nerve singing with tension. They cleared the alley, then the edge of town, and only when Silver Rock had shrunk to a collection of matchstick buildings behind them did Eliza lower the derringer. "Would you have shot me?" John asked. "I don't know," she admitted, sagging against his back. "I've become someone I don't recognize anymore. Necessity has a way of changing people." They rode in silence across the desert, the morning heat already building toward its brutal afternoon peak. John's ranch lay 5 miles north, nestled in a valley where a seasonal creek provided just enough water to run a small cattle operation. It wasn't much, a 2-room cabin, a barn that leaked in the rare rains, and 40 head of longhorns that seemed to thrive on neglect and spite. "It's not what you're used to," he said as they approached. Eliza slid from the horse, studying the humble spread. "Mr. McAllister, what I'm used to is being locked in a room for 2 months, then walking across a desert for 3 days. Your home looks like paradise." Inside, John pumped water for coffee while Eliza collapsed into one of his 2 chairs. The cabin was Spartan, but clean, a soldier's habit that had outlasted his service. His few possessions were practical cooking gear, a rifle and ammunition, some books, and a daguerreotype on the mantel that he didn't look at anymore. "Your wife?" Eliza asked, noticing his glance. "Was." John busied himself with the coffee. "Sarah. She and our son died while I was away playing soldier. Fever took them both." "I'm sorry." It was a long time ago, but the words came out rough, like they always did when he scraped against that particular scar. "Is that why you helped me? Because you couldn't help them?" John considered this as he poured coffee into tin cups. "Maybe. Or maybe I'm just tired of watching the strong prey on the weak. Saw enough of that in the war to last several lifetimes." They drank in companionable silence, the weight of shared losses creating an unexpected bond. Outside, a roadrunner called, and the wind whispered secrets through the mesquite. "They'll come here," Eliza said eventually. "Rusty, Thornton, others, I've brought trouble to your door." Trouble was already on its way. You just gave it a name and a face. John moved to the window, checking the horizon from habit. "Question is, what do we do about it? You can't run forever, and $800 won't go away on its own." "I have money," Eliza said quietly. "Hidden in various banks under different names. James taught me to be careful, to always have escape routes. If I could get to Denver or San Francisco." "They'll be watching the stage lines, the trains, and traveling alone got you this far, but luck runs out." "Then what do you suggest?" John turned from the window, decision crystallizing. "We need the truth to matter again. That means finding someone who'll listen. Someone the Morrison family can't buy or intimidate. There's a federal marshal in Fort Davis, Judge Roy Harding. He's got a reputation for being incorruptible. If we could get you there, with your story and whatever proof you might have." "Fort Davis is over 100 miles through Apache territory," Eliza interrupted. "And what proof it's my word against theirs?" "Then we'll have to find some. The Morrisons aren't the only ones who can play games with the law." A plan was forming, dangerous and probably foolish, but better than waiting for the hunters to arrive. "But first, we need to deal with our immediate problems. This place is defensible, but not against a determined siege. We need supplies, ammunition, and information about who else might be coming for that bounty." "You're talking about war." "I'm talking about survival," John corrected. "Yours and mine both, now." Eliza stood, moving to stand beside him at the window. In the harsh light, he could see faint bruises on her wrists, testimony to her captivity that made his jaw tighten. "I didn't ask for a protector, Mr. McAllister." "No, but you've got one anyway, and it's John. If we're going to be fighting for our lives together, we might as well use first names." She smiled then, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her. It transformed her face, revealing the woman she must have been before tragedy and flight had marked her. "Very well, John. And I suppose you should know I wasn't bluffing back there. I would have shot anyone who tried to stop me. The woman I was in Topeka. The dutiful wife who hosted tea parties and worried about propriety. She's as dead as Tom Morrison." "Good," John said grimly. "Because the woman who walked out of that desert, who faced down Rusty Kane's gang with nothing but nerve and a derringer, that's the woman who might survive what's coming." They spent the rest of the day preparing. John cleaned and loaded every weapon in the place, while Eliza helped organize supplies and learn the cabin's layout. As the sun began its descent, painting the desert in shades of blood and gold, dust clouds appeared on the southern horizon. "They're coming," Eliza said unnecessarily. John checked his rifle one more time. "Let them come. This is my land, my fight now. And I've got something they don't." "What's that?" "Nothing left to lose except what's right in front of me." He looked at her steadily. "And I'm done losing things that matter." The dust clouds grew closer, and with them came the reckoning that had been building since a desperate woman walked into Big Tom's saloon. But for the first time in years, John McAllister felt truly alive, like a man with a purpose instead of a ghost simply existing. Whatever came next, he wouldn't face it alone, and neither would she. The riders came with the dying light, their silhouettes dark against the crimson sky. John counted 8 men more than he'd hoped, fewer than he'd feared. They stopped just outside rifle range, and Rusty Kane's voice carried across the desert air. "McAllister, we know she's in there. Send her out and this ends peaceful-like." John's answer came from his Winchester, the shot kicking up dust near Rusty's horse. "That's close as you get to my property. Kane, next one won't miss." "You're outnumbered, you fool." "Been outnumbered before. Still here." But even as he spoke, John knew the mathematics of their situation. 8 men could surround the cabin, wait them out, or worse, burn them out. He glanced at Eliza, who had positioned herself at the back window with his spare rifle, her face set in grim determination. "They're moving to flank us," she reported, her voice steady despite the circumstances. That's when they herded more horses approaching from the east. John's heart sank. Reinforcements would make their situation impossible. But the new arrivals weren't joining Rusty's group. Instead, a lone rider emerged from the gathering darkness, hands raised. "That's far enough," John called out. "Easy there, McAllister." The voice was gravelly, aged. "Name's Samuel Crenshaw. I'm a minister. Or was back in Kansas. I've come about Mrs. Morrison, Mrs. Eliza gasped softly. "Reverend Crenshaw, but how?" "Later, child," the old man replied. "Right now, we need to deal with these gentlemen. Mr. Kane, I have documentation here that might interest you. Proof that the charges against this woman are false, manufactured by the Morrison family." Rusty laughed harshly. "Don't care if she's innocent as a newborn babe. Preacher, $800 is $800. "Then you're no better than a slave catcher," Crenshaw said, his voice carrying the thunderous disapproval of a man used to denouncing sin from the pulpit. "And you'll answer for it, if not in this life, then the next." "I'll take my chances with the Almighty." Rusty sneered. "Boys, get ready to—" The night exploded. Not from Rusty's men, but from the North Apache war cries splitting the air like lightning. Everyone scattered as arrows whistled through the darkness, followed by the crack of stolen rifles. "Inside!" John grabbed Eliza's arm, pulling her away from the window as glass shattered. Reverend Crenshaw spurred his horse toward the cabin, barely making it to the door before John hauled him inside. "Apaches?" Eliza asked, her face pale but composed. "Mescaleros, from the sound of it," John confirmed. Risking a glance outside, Rusty's men had forgotten about the cabin entirely, fighting for their lives against an enemy that knew this land like their own heartbeat. They must have been tracking Rusty's group. Too many horses, too much noise might as well have rung a dinner bell. The battle outside raged with savage intensity. John could see muzzle flashes, hear the screams of horses and men. Part of him thought they should help. No man deserved to die like that, not even Rusty Kane. But his first duty was to the people under his roof. "We need to move," he decided. "While they're distracted, Reverend, can you ride?" 73 years old and still in the saddle. Crenshaw confirmed, though I wasn't expecting quite this much excitement. They gathered what supplies they could carry: ammunition, water, food for a few days. John saddled his spare mount for the Reverend while Eliza stuffed the old man's documents into her carpet bag. "What are these papers?" she asked as they prepared to leave. "Tom Morrison's real cause of death," Crenshaw replied. "Witness statement from the housemaid who saw him drunk, saw him attack you, saw him fall. She came to me in secret, terrified, but unable to live with the lie. There's more evidence of the family's attempts to forge James's will, testimony from others they've wronged. Why risk yourself for this?" The old man's eyes were kind but fierce. "Because I married you and James, child. I knew what kind of man he was, what kind of woman you are. When I heard what his family was doing," he shook his head. "Some things a man of God cannot abide." The fighting outside had intensified, moving away from the cabin as Rusty's men retreated toward Silver Rock. John led them out the back, keeping low, using every shadow and fold in the land. They'd gone perhaps a mile when Eliza suddenly stumbled, crying out softly. "What is it?" John was beside her instantly. "My ankle. I'm sorry, She tried to stand and nearly fell again. Without hesitation, John lifted her onto his horse, then swung up behind her. The necessity of it put them in close contact, her body pressed against his as they rode. He could feel her trembling, not from fear, he realized, but from exhaustion and the release of tension. They rode through the night, navigating by stars and John's knowledge of the land. The Reverend followed gamely, though John could hear his labored breathing. They needed shelter, a place to rest and regroup. "There!" John pointed to a cluster of rocks ahead. "Box Canyon, defensible, with water." The canyon was really more of a deep cleft in the rocks, but it offered protection and concealment. A small spring trickled from the stones, feeding a pool before disappearing back into the earth. John helped Eliza down, noting how she leaned on him, how natural it felt to support her. They made a cold camp, no fire to attract attention. John examined Eliza's ankle by moonlight, finding it swollen but not broken, as he wrapped it with cloth torn from his shirt. She watched his face in the silver light. "You've done this before," she observed. "Field medicine. Learned it the hard way." His hands were gentle but efficient. "This will need proper tending when we reach safety." "Safety," she repeated softly. "I'm beginning to think that's just a word people made up to comfort children." Reverend Crenshaw had dozed off, his soft snores echoing in the canyon. John and Eliza sat close together, sharing warmth against the desert's night chill. The silence between them was different now, charged with unspoken understanding. "Tell me something," Eliza said quietly. "When you lost your family, how did you keep going?" John considered the question, one he'd never really answered even for himself. "One day at a time, one breath, one step, one sunrise. You don't think about healing or moving on. You just continue. And eventually, you realize you're living again instead of just existing." "Is that what you've been doing, just existing?" "Until yesterday," he admitted, the words coming unbidden. "When you walked into that saloon, something shifted." She turned to look at him fully then, and the moonlight caught the tears on her cheeks. "I'm so tired of being strong," she whispered. "Everyone wants me to break, to give in, to be the weak woman they expect. But I can't. If I stop fighting, even for a moment, they win, and I become nothing again. You're not nothing, John said fiercely. You're the strongest person I've met in 10 years, but being strong doesn't mean being alone. That's when she said it, the words tumbling out like water through a broken dam. I'm naked, John, stripped of everything I once was. My name, my home, my reputation all gone. I don't even know who I am anymore. The raw honesty of it, the complete vulnerability, hit him like a physical blow. Without thought, moving on instinct older than reason. John pulled her into his arms. She resisted for a moment, her body rigid with the habit of self-protection, then collapsed against him with a sound that was part sob, part relief. He held her as she shook, this woman who'd faced down armed men without flinching but couldn't bear the weight of her own humanity another moment. Her tears soaked through his shirt, and he found himself stroking her hair, murmuring wordless comfort. You're Elizabeth Harrow, he said softly. You're the woman who walked out of the desert when anyone else would have died. You're the woman who stood up to Rusty Kane with nothing but courage and a derringer. You're here, you're alive, and you're not alone anymore. She pulled back enough to look at him, her face streaked with tears, but somehow more beautiful for the honesty of it. I don't even know who Elizabeth Harrow is. I made her up somewhere between Topeka and here. Then maybe that's who you're meant to be. Not the person they tried to make you, but the one you chose to become. Something shifted in her expression, and suddenly the space between them seemed both infinite and impossibly small. John became acutely aware of every point of contact, her hands gripping his shirt, the warmth of her body against his, the way her breath caught as their eyes met. John, she whispered, and in that single word was question and answer, plea and permission. He kissed her then, or perhaps she kissed him later. Neither could remember who moved first. It was desperate and gentle at once, tasting of tears and dust and the peculiar sweetness of finding something worth saving in a world full of loss. For a moment, the desert disappeared. The danger vanished, and there was only this two broken people discovering they might make something whole together. When they parted, both breathing unsteadily, Eliza touched his face with wondering fingers. This is madness, she said, but she was almost smiling. The whole world's mad, John replied. Maybe that's the only sane response. A sound from outside the canyon made them both freeze horses, moving carefully through the darkness. John reached for his rifle, but Eliza caught his hand. Wait, she breathed, listening intently. That's not Apache movement, too heavy, too regular. She was right. These horses were shod, their riders making attempts at stealth that no Apache would bother with. John counted heartbeats, judging distance and numbers. Thornton, he concluded. The bounty hunter, he must have avoided the fight, followed our trail. How many? 3, maybe 4. John's mind raced through options. The canyon that had seemed like shelter now felt like a trap. One way in meant one way out. I'll surrender, Eliza said immediately. They want me, not you or the Reverend. Like hell. John, we've had this discussion. Nobody's surrendering to anybody. He gently disengaged from her embrace. All business now despite the lingering warmth of their kiss. Wake the Reverend, quietly. But Crenshaw was already awake, his eyes bright in the moonlight. I may be old, but I'm not deaf, he said dryly. What's the plan? John studied the canyon walls, measuring angles and distances. They'll expect us to ford up, make a stand. Instead, we're going to do something stupid. How stupid? Eliza asked. Cavalry charge stupid. Mount up, ride straight at them before they can get set. Speed and surprise are all we've got. That's not stupid, Crenshaw observed. That's insane. Sometimes they're the same thing. John helped Eliza onto his horse again, her ankles still too weak for running. Reverend, you break left when we clear the canyon. Make for Fort Davis. It's 50 miles southwest. Get those documents to Marshal Harding. What about you? We'll lead them off, Buy you time. He pressed extra ammunition into the old man's hands. Whatever happens, make sure the truth gets told. Crenshaw gripped John's shoulder. God ride with you, son. He'd better, John muttered, swinging up behind Eliza. We're going to need all the help we can get. They positioned themselves at the canyon mouth, horses bunched and ready. John could hear Thornton's men spreading out, preparing to bottle them in. In a few minutes, they'd be in position, and escape would be impossible. Now, John whispered, and spurred his horse forward. They exploded from the canyon like grapes shot from a cannon. The Reverend peeling left as planned, while John and Eliza charged straight at the shadowy figures ahead. Guns blazed in the darkness, muzzle flashes like angry stars. John felt bullets whisper past, heard Eliza gasp as she fired the Derringer at shapes in the night. Then they were through, racing across the desert with shouts and gunfire behind them. John's horse strong. Steady Sage stretched out in a gallop that ate up ground. He could hear pursuit, but it was scattered, confused. The Reverend had made it clear John caught a glimpse of him disappearing into a stand of cottonwoods. They rode hard for an hour, using every trick John knew to confuse their trail. Doublebacks, stream crossings, rocky ground that wouldn't hold prints. Finally, when Sage was lathered and blowing, they stopped in the lee of a massive boulder. Are we clear? Eliza asked, her voice hoarse. For now, but come dawn, they'll pick up the trail again. John dismounted, checking Sage for injuries. By some miracle, they'd come through unscathed. How's your ankle? I'll live. She slid down carefully, testing her weight. John, what you did back there was necessary. But he knew she wasn't talking about the escape. The kiss, the moment of connection it hung between them like morning mist. Impossible to grasp, but undeniably real. Was it? She moved closer, her eyes searching his face. Or are we both just so desperate for something good that we're seeing mirages? Does it matter? John touched her cheek, marveling at the softness after so much hardness in the world. Real or mirage, it's the first thing I've felt in 10 years that made me glad to be alive. She leaned into his touch, and, for a moment, they stood there. Two people stripped of pretense and propriety, naked in all the ways that mattered. The desert stretched endless around them, full of danger and uncertainty. But somehow that made this moment more precious, not less. So what now? Eliza asked softly. Now we keep moving, John said, though every instinct screamed to stay in this moment forever. The Reverend will need at least 2 days to reach Fort Davis. We need to keep Thornton and whoever else is out there focused on us. A running battle across the desert? Eliza smiled wryly. Not exactly how I pictured my life going. No, John found himself almost smiling back. What did you picture? Tea parties, charity work, raising children who'd never know hunger or fear. Her smile faded. Foolish dreams of a foolish girl. Not foolish, John said firmly. Just postponed. When this is over... Don't, she interrupted gently. Don't make promises about after. I've learned that tomorrow isn't guaranteed to anyone. She was right, of course. But as they mounted up again, John found himself making promises anyway, silent vows to whatever forces governed the universe that he'd see her safe, see her free, see her have the chance to dream new dreams. The night wrapped around them as they rode on. Two souls stripped bare by circumstance and choosing to face the darkness together. Behind them, danger followed like a hungry wolf. Ahead, uncertainty stretched to every horizon. But for now, in this moment between heartbeats, they had each other. And sometimes, John reflected as Eliza leaned back against him, her trust a gift more precious than gold. Sometimes that was enough. Sometimes it was everything. Dawn painted the desert in shades of amber and rose as John watched Eliza sleep. They'd found shelter in a grove of cottonwoods near a dying creek, and exhaustion had finally claimed her. In repose, Her face lost its hard edges, revealing the woman she might have been in a kinder world. The sight stirred memories John had buried beneath 10 years of dust and solitude. Sarah had slept like that, one hand curled beneath her cheek, trust written in every line of her body. The comparison should have hurt, but instead, it brought an unexpected peace. Sarah would have liked Eliza, would have admired her strength. His reverie shattered at the sound of approaching horses. John was on his feet instantly, rifle ready, but relaxed marginally when he recognized the rider. Miguel Delgado, a vaquero from a neighboring ranch, emerged from the morning haze leading a spare mount. "Senor McAllister," Miguel touched his hat brim, "I bring news from town, and supplies." He tossed down a bulging saddlebag.
"How bad is it?"
"Malo. Very bad. The Apache killed 3 of Cain's men. Cain himself survived, and he's—" Miguel searched for words. "Como un loco. Like a madman. He says you brought the Apache down on them, that you're in league with savages." Eliza stirred at their voices, sitting up with the instant alertness of someone who'd learned sleep could mean death. "What else?" she asked, reading the concern on Miguel's weathered face. "More hunters come. The Morrison family. They raise the bounty. $1,000 now. Men ride in from Amarillo, from El Paso, even from Mexico." Miguel's eyes were sympathetic. "They say an army comes for you, Senora."
"An army?"
Eliza repeated softly. She stood, brushing dust from her borrowed dress with movements that spoke of bone-deep weariness. "Then we stop running. I won't have more blood on my hands." "No." John's response was immediate, fierce. "We've come too far to quit now. Reverend Crenshaw needs time." "Time bought with your life with Miguel's. If he helps us—" Eliza shook her head. "I've been selfish, letting fear drive me, but no more." Miguel cleared his throat. "Pardon, but there is more. A man came to town yesterday, federal marshal, badge and all. He asks questions about the Senora, about the charges against her." John's pulse quickened. "Harding from Fort Davis." "No, Senor. This one calls himself Wallace. Says he's investigating the Morrison family for other crimes, theft from government contracts, bribing federal judges. He seems interested in the truth." "Or it's a trap," Eliza said flatly. "The Morrisons have money enough to buy federal badges." "Perhaps," Miguel agreed. "But he also arrested Thornton, the bounty hunter. Said hunting fugitives requires proper warrants, not just wanted posters." A slight smile crossed his face. Thornton was very unhappy. John weighed the information, military instincts warring with hope. Every advantage could be a trap, but every trap could also be turned to advantage. "Where's this Marshal Wallace now?" "He makes camp outside town. Says he'll wait 3 days for anyone with information about the Morrisons to come forward." Miguel hesitated. He also said to tell John McAllister that Colonel Briggs sends his regards. The name hit John like a physical blow. Briggs had been his commanding officer, one of the few men who'd known the full truth about John's discharge from the cavalry, a discharge that had more to do with refusing illegal orders than anything in the official record. "You know him?" Eliza asked, reading his reaction. "I knew Briggs. If Wallace is really connected to him—" John made his decision. "We need to move. Miguel, gracias, amigo. Get clear of this. You've risked enough." "Vaya con Dios." Miguel replied, but before leaving, he pressed something into Eliza's hand, a small wooden cross. "From Padre Francisco. He says to tell you God has not abandoned you, Senora." After Miguel departed, they broke camp quickly. John's mind raced through possibilities as they rode. If Wallace was legitimate, he represented their best chance. If not— "You're thinking about your family," Eliza said suddenly. John started. "What makes you say that?" "The way your jaw tightens. You've done it before when something reminded you of them." She shifted in the saddle to look at him. "Tell me about them." "Why?" Because we might die today, she said simply. And I'd like to know the man I'm dying beside. The brutal honesty of it caught him off guard. John found himself speaking words he hadn't voiced in years. Sarah was light. That's the only way I can describe her. She made everything brighter just by being in the room. Came from good family back east. Could have married anybody. But she chose a cavalry officer with more pride than sense. And your son, Thomas, 4 years old when... John's throat tightened. He had Sarah's smile and my stubbornness. Was just learning to ride when I left for the war. I promised him I'd teach him to shoot when I got back. I'm sorry, Eliza said softly. The worst part was the letter. Reached me 2 months after they died. Sarah wrote about Thomas starting school, about the new curtains she'd made, about missing me but being proud of my service. His laugh was bitter. She was already gone when she wrote it. Already gone. And I was playing soldier, thinking I was saving the world. You couldn't have known. No, but I could have been there. Could have resigned my commission. Stayed home like she asked. But I was too proud. Too sure my duty was out there instead of with them. He met her eyes. That's why I couldn't let you face those men alone. I've had enough of duty that leaves good people to suffer. Eliza reached back, her hand finding his where it rested on the saddle horn. She wouldn't blame you. John, no woman who loved you would. How do you know? Because I wouldn't. The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Because loving someone means understanding what drives them, even when it takes them away. They rode in silence after that, but it was a different silence, one filled with shared understanding rather than unspoken questions. The sun climbed higher, baking the desert into a shimmer of heat mirages and false promises. John kept them to the shadows when possible, always watching their back trail. It was near noon when they saw the dust cloud. How many? Eliza asked, shading her eyes. Too many. John studied the approaching riders through field glasses Miguel had provided. 20, maybe more, moving fast and spread out. They know where we're heading. Then we changed direction. No. John lowered the glasses. Decision made. We're done running. Time to see if Marshal Wallace is what he claims. They pushed harder, Sage beginning to labor under the double weight and killing pace. The pursuit gained ground steadily, relentlessly. John could make out individual riders, now Kane's men mixed with faces he didn't recognize, all united in purpose by the promise of gold. The marshal's camp appeared like a mirage made real military precise with good sight lines and defensive positions. A man stood as they approached, badge glinting in the sun. He was younger than John expected, with intelligent eyes and the careful movements of someone who'd survived by being faster than the other man. Mrs. Morrison. Wallace called. John McAllister. I'm Federal Marshal James Wallace. I think we should talk. Talk fast, John replied, dismounting and helping Eliza down. We've got company coming. Wallace's eyes flicked to the pursuing dust cloud. So I see. Mrs. Morrison, or do you prefer Harrow? I'm investigating your late husband's family for numerous federal crimes. Your testimony could be crucial. And in exchange? Eliza asked, exhaustion making her blunt. The federal charges against you disappear. The murder charge is a state matter, but with Reverend Crenshaw's evidence and my report, no jury would convict. Wallace smiled thinly. Assuming we survive the next hour, of course. You could ride out, John suggested. This isn't your fight. Actually, it is. Wallace drew his sidearm, checking the loads with practiced ease. The Morrisons tried to have me killed in Kansas City. Made it personal. Besides, Colonel Briggs spoke highly of you. McAllister said you were the best soldier he ever commanded, and the most principled. I figure a man like that is worth standing beside. The pursuing riders had stopped just out of rifle range, milling about as they realized the situation had changed. Kane's voice carried across the distance, but his words were lost in the wind. What wasn't lost was the intent as the riders began spreading out, preparing to encircle the camp. "They'll try to talk first," Wallace predicted. "Probably offer to split the bounty if I look the other way. When that fails—" He shrugged eloquently. "I should go to them," Eliza said suddenly. "End this before—" "No." John and Wallace spoke simultaneously, then shared a look of understanding. "Ma'am," Wallace continued, "you're under federal protection now. Anyone who wants you goes through us. 2 men against 20. 3, Eliza corrected, checking her derringer. "Though I'll need something with more range than this." John handed her his spare revolver without hesitation. "You know how to use it." "James insisted I learn. He said a woman should be able to defend herself." Her smile was sharp as winter ice. The Morrisons probably regret that now. Kane had ridden forward, stopping just within shouting distance. The years hadn't been kind to him. The scar on his face had been joined by others. And something wild lurked in his eyes that spoke of a man with nothing left to lose. "McAllister," he called, "you cost me 3 good men. Their blood's on your hands." "The Apache killed your men, Rusty," John replied calmly. "Maybe you should take it up with them." "You brought them down on us. You and that woman." Kane spat in the dust. "But I'm willing to be reasonable. Send her out, and we all ride away rich." "Can't do it." "Then you'll die for nothing, for a woman who ain't worth the ground she stands on." Wallace stepped forward, badge prominent. "Federal Marshal, Kane. Anyone who attacks this camp is attacking a representative of the United States government. That's a hanging offense." Kane laughed, an ugly sound that carried no humor. "Marshal, you're a long way from anywhere that badge means something. Out here, gold speaks louder than the law." "Then let's see how loud gunpowder speaks," John said quietly. The moment stretched taut, balanced on a knife's edge. John could feel Eliza beside him, steady despite everything. In his peripheral vision, Wallace had shifted position slightly, improving his angle of fire. The arithmetic of violence was simple. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and caught in the open. By any reasonable measure, they were dead. But reason had abandoned John the moment Eliza walked into his life. He'd spent 10 years being reasonable, being careful, being dead inside. Now, facing impossible odds with an unlikely woman at his side, he felt more alive than he had since Sarah's death. "Your move, Rusty," he called, his hand hovering near his gun. "But think hard. You might take us, but not all of you will ride away. Is gold worth bleeding out in the dust?" Kane's face twisted with indecision. Behind him, his men shifted restlessly. The bounty was substantial, but death was permanent. In the end, greed won over caution. It usually did. "Take them," Kane roared, going for his gun. The world exploded into chaos. John's Colt cleared leather with the speed of long practice, his first shot taking one of Kane's men center mass. Beside him, Eliza fired with surprising accuracy, while Wallace proved why he'd survived as a federal marshal in lawless territory. They gave better than they got in those first crucial seconds. But numbers began to tell. John felt a bullet pluck at his sleeve. Another whine passed his ear. They needed cover. Needed. The thunder of hooves announced new arrivals. For a moment, John's heart sank. More bounty hunters would finish them. But the riders who crested the hill wore cavalry blue, and their Spencer rifles spoke with disciplined precision. 7th Cavalry, detached unit under Lieutenant Morrison," the lead rider announced as Kane's men scattered before the unexpected assault. "Stand down, all of you." The Reverend had made it through. Somehow. Impossibly. Crenshaw had reached someone in authority and convinced them to act. The tide of battle reversed in moments. Kane's rabble no match for trained soldiers. Kane himself, blood streaming from a shoulder wound, tried to flee. His horse made it 3 strides before John's shot took him from the saddle. The outlaw hit the ground hard and didn't move again. In the sudden silence that followed, John found himself still standing, still breathing. Beside him, Eliza swayed but remained upright, a graze on her cheek the only sign she'd been in a gunfight. Wallace holstered his weapon with the satisfied air of a man who'd bet on the right horse. "Excellent timing, Lieutenant," the marshal said, "though I'm curious how you happen to be in the area." "Reverend Crenshaw reached Fort Davis yesterday," the officer replied. "Colonel Harding reviewed his evidence and dispatched us immediately. We're to escort Mrs. Harrow to the fort for a formal hearing." He looked at Eliza with something approaching sympathy. "Ma'am, I'm James Morrison, no relation to your late husband's family. Despite the name, you have my word you'll be treated fairly." "The word of the law," Eliza said softly, exhaustion clear in every line of her body. "Forgive me if I find that less than reassuring." "Then take mine," John said, moving closer to her. "I'll be with you every step." She looked up at him, and in her eyes he saw reflections of all they'd shared, fear and courage, desperation and hope. That moment in the canyon when souls touched across the divide of loss. Every step. "Everyone that matters." Lieutenant Morrison cleared his throat. "We should move. The Apache are still active in this area, and I'd prefer to reach the fort before nightfall." As they prepared to leave, John caught Eliza's hand. Around them, soldiers secured prisoners and tended wounded, but for a moment they might have been alone in the universe. "Whatever happens at the fort," he said quietly, "you're not alone anymore. Not ever again." She squeezed his hand, a lifetime of communication in that simple gesture. "I know," she whispered. "That's what terrifies me most. I've remembered what it feels like to have something to lose. Then we'll face that fear together," John promised. "Like we've faced everything else." They rode out as the sun began its descent, a cavalry escort replacing pursuit, hope replacing desperation. But John kept his hand near his gun anyway. The law might be on their side now, but the Morrisons had deep pockets and long reach. The battle was won, but the war for Eliza's freedom had just begun. And John McAllister, who'd thought his fighting days were over, prepared for one more campaign this time with something worth fighting for riding beside him. In the distance, Fort Davis appeared like a promise on the horizon. Whether it was a promise of justice or just another battlefield remained to be seen. But whatever came, they'd face it as they'd learned to face everything together, honest and stripped of all pretense except the truth that sometimes, in the midst of losing everything, you find the one thing worth saving. The storm hit them at Widow's Pass, 30 miles from Fort Davis. It came screaming out of the mountains like a living thing, driving sand and grit with enough force to strip skin from bone. The cavalry unit, caught in the open, had seconds to react. "Dismount! Form a barrier with the horses!" Lieutenant Morrison's voice barely carried over the wind's howl. John pulled Eliza from Sage's back, wrapping his duster around them both as they huddled behind the mare's solid bulk. The world disappeared into a brown hell of swirling dust and debris. Horses screamed, men cursed, and somewhere in the chaos, John heard the distinctive crack of rifle fire. "That's not thunder," Eliza shouted in his ear. She was right. Through gaps in the storm, muzzle flashes appeared like deadly fireflies. Someone was using the sandstorm as cover for an ambush. John drew his Colt, though visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. A figure loomed out of the dust, not cavalry blue but civilian clothes. Gun raised. John fired by instinct, the man spinning away into the storm. Another appeared, then another. This wasn't random bandits taking advantage of chaos. This was coordinated, planned. "The Morrisons?" Wallace appeared beside them, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead. "They must have hired guns to intercept us." The battle took on a nightmarish quality, fought in glimpses and shadows. John emptied his Colt, reloaded, fired again. Beside him, Eliza used the spare revolver with deadly calm. placing shots with the precision of someone who'd moved past fear into pure survival instinct. A horse went down nearby, its rider one of Morrison's soldiers pinned beneath it. Without hesitation, Eliza broke from cover to help him. John lunged after her, arriving just as an attacker emerged from the storm. Time slowed as the gunman's barrel swung toward Eliza's exposed back. John's shot took the man high in the chest, but not before the attacker fired. The bullet caught John in the side, spinning him into the dust. Pain exploded through his ribs, hot and immediate. He tried to rise, saw Eliza's horrified face through the haze, tried to tell her to take cover. Then the storm passed as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving eerie silence in its wake. The aftermath was a scene from Dante. Dead men and horses littered the ground. Half the cavalry unit was down, the survivors bloodied and shaken. The attackers who hadn't fled were beyond questioning, their employer's identity dying with them. Eliza was beside him, her hands pressing against the wound in his side. "Don't you dare! Don't you dare leave me now!" "Just a scratch," he managed, though the words came out wet with blood. Corporal Davis, Lieutenant Morrison, appeared, taking charge despite a wounded arm. "Get the medical supplies. Mrs. Harrow, keep pressure on that wound. We need to move, there could be more coming." They fashioned a travois from cavalry lances and blankets, every bump and jostle sending fresh agony through John's body. Eliza rode beside him, her face set in lines of determination that reminded him why he'd fallen for her in the first place. "Stay with me," she commanded, her voice fierce. "You promised every step. Remember, this doesn't count as a step if you're unconscious." He tried to laugh, coughed blood instead. The world began to gray at the edges, but he fought it, focusing on her face, on the tears she refused to let fall, somewhere in the haze of pain and movement. He heard Lieutenant Morrison arguing with Wallace about pushing forward versus making camp. "The fort!" John rasped. "Get her to the fort!" "We'll get there," Eliza promised. "All of us." Time became fluid. Desert gave way to rocky terrain, then the blessed sight of Fort Davis's walls. John was vaguely aware of being carried, of Eliza's voice raised in demands for a doctor, of cool hands examining his wound. Then darkness claimed him, and he let it, trusting that she would be there when he woke. He dreamed of Sarah, but for the first time in years, it wasn't a nightmare. She stood in a field of wildflowers, Thomas at her side, both smiling. "Take care of her," Sarah said, and somehow he understood she meant Eliza. "You've punished yourself long enough." When consciousness returned, it came slowly, like swimming up from deep water. The first thing he registered was pain, a dull, throbbing ache in his side that spoke of survival rather than dying. The second was a hand holding his warm and real and desperately tight. "If you're awake, open your eyes," Eliza's voice, rough with exhaustion. "The doctor says you'll live, but I need to see for myself." John managed to crack his eyelids, finding her face inches from his own. She looked terrible, dust-caked, blood-stained, beautiful. "How long?" "2 days. You lost a lot of blood." Her free hand touched his face gently. "You saved my life. Again. Starting to make a habit of it. One I'd prefer you break. I can't," her voice cracked. "I can't lose anyone else. John, not you." He squeezed her hand, trying to convey what words couldn't capture. They stayed like that until a knock interrupted Marshal Wallace entering with a man John recognized from newspaper sketches. Judge Roy Harding. Wallace made introductions. "He's here to discuss the situation." Harding was a small man with the presence of someone much larger, eyes sharp as flint behind wire spectacles. "Mr. McAllister, I understand you've been instrumental in protecting Mrs. Harrow. That speaks well of your character." "Just doing what's right," John said, though the effort of speaking cost him. "Indeed. Well, I've reviewed Reverend Crenshaw's documents and Marshal Wallace's report. The federal charges against Mrs. Harrow are dismissed. As for the state charges, Harding smiled thinly. It seems the Morrison family has bigger problems. Federal investigators arrested 2 of the brothers this morning for mail fraud, bribery, and conspiracy. Their house of cards is collapsing.
Then I'm free,
Eliza asked, hardly daring to hope. Not quite. There's still the matter of Tom Morrison's death. However, with the maid's testimony and evidence of the family's conspiracy against you, I'm confident any fair court would acquit. I've arranged for the trial to be held here at Fort Davis, under federal supervision. The Morrisons' influence doesn't extend this far. After Harding and Wallace left, Eliza finally allowed herself to cry great, shaking sobs that spoke of months of fear and tension finally released. John pulled her down beside him on the narrow bed, ignoring the protest from his wound. She curled against his good side, and he held her as she had held him through the storm. "It's almost over," he murmured into her hair. "No," she corrected softly. "It's almost beginning." The trial, when it came, was almost anticlimactic. The maid, brought under federal protection, testified to Tom Morrison's drunken attack, Eliza's desperate defense, the accidental fall. Other witnesses emerged servants and business associates who'd suffered under the Morrison family's tyranny, emboldened by the federal investigation to speak truth. John watched from a chair still too weak to stand for long as Eliza faced her accusers with quiet dignity. She wore a simple black dress that Mary from Big Tom's had sent, her hair pulled back severely, but to John she'd never looked more beautiful. This was the woman who'd walked out of the desert, who'd faced down armed men, who'd held him together when his blood painted the sand red. The jury deliberated for less than an hour. "Not guilty," the foreman announced, and the courtroom erupted. Eliza stood frozen for a moment, as if unable to process the words. Then she turned, her eyes finding John's across the room, and the smile that broke across her face was like sunrise after the longest night. Later, after the congratulations and paperwork, after Reverend Crenshaw had blessed them both with tears in his eyes, after Marshal Wallace had shaken their hands and ridden off to new adventures, John and Eliza found themselves alone on the fort's wall, watching sunset paint the desert in shades of fire. "What now?" Eliza asked, echoing her question from that night in the canyon. But this time, there was a hope in it rather than despair. "Now we live," John said simply. "My ranch isn't much, but it's a start. We can build something better together." She turned to face him fully, her hands coming to rest on his chest. "Is that a proposal, Mr. McAllister?" "It's a promise," he corrected. "If you'll have me, a broken-down cavalry officer with more scars than sense doesn't have much to offer." She silenced him with a kiss, gentle, mindful of his healing wound, but full of promise. When they parted, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "You offered me your protection when I was a stranger. You bled for me when I was hunted. You gave me hope when I had none. John McAllister, you've already given me everything. Then let me give you one thing more." He reached into his pocket, producing a simple gold band, his mother's ring, carried through war and loss, waiting for a reason to bring it into the light again. "Elizabeth Harrow, will you marry me?" "Yes," she said. No hesitation, no doubt. "Though I think it's time to choose a new name. Elizabeth Morrison is dead, and Eliza Harrow was born from desperation. I want to be someone new, someone who chose her life instead of having it chosen for her." "Eliza McAllister has a nice sound," John suggested. "Yes," she agreed, slipping the ring onto her finger where it caught the dying light. "It does." They were married a week later in the fort's chapel, Reverend Crenshaw presiding with joy that transformed his weathered face. Lieutenant Morrison stood as witness, having become a friend through shared battle. The ceremony was simple, the gathering small, but John had never seen anything more beautiful than Eliza walking toward him in a borrowed white dress, her face radiant with happiness hard-won. That night, as they lay together in the small quarters the fort had provided, Eliza traced the scar on his side with gentle fingers. "We're quite a pair," she murmured, "both of us carrying wounds that will never fully heal." "Scars just mean we survived," John replied, catching her hand and pressing it to his heart. "They're proof we're still here, still fighting." "I don't want to fight anymore," she said softly. "I want to build a home, a life. Maybe," she trailed off, suddenly shy. "Maybe what?" "Children. If we're blessed, I want to give you what was taken." "No." He cupped her face gently. "Not replacements. Never that, but new lives, new love, new chances. Sarah and Thomas will always be part of me, but you're my future, Eliza. You're my resurrection." She kissed him then, and there were no more words, only the language of touch and breath and hearts beating in unison. Outside, coyotes called to the rising moon, and the desert wind whispered secrets through the fort's walls. But inside, two souls who'd found each other across a landscape of loss created their own world, their own truth, their own tomorrow. The next morning, they loaded what few possessions they had into a wagon provided by Judge Harding, a wedding gift, he'd said with gruff kindness, as they prepared to leave Fort Davis for John's ranch. Eliza paused, looking back at the fort that had been her salvation. "No regrets?" John asked. "None," she said firmly. "The woman who was hunted across this desert died in that courtroom. The woman riding away is someone entirely new." "And who is she?" Eliza climbed onto the wagon seat beside him, taking the reins with confidence born from surviving the unsurvivable. "She's a rancher's wife who knows how to shoot straight and ride hard. She's a woman who chose her own path. She's yours, John McAllister, as you are hers." "Forever?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Forever," she confirmed, and snapped the reins. They rode toward home, not the home he'd built in solitude and sorrow, but the home they would create together from hope and determination. Behind them, Fort Davis faded into memory. Ahead, the desert stretched endless and full of promise, no longer a place of pursuit and fear, but a canvas on which to paint their new life. The ghosts of the past rode with them, they always would. But now those ghosts were tempered by the promise of the future, by love that had bloomed in the harshest ground, by the simple miracle of two broken people making something whole. The sun climbed higher, blessing their journey with light, and somewhere in the vast blue sky, an eagle cried wild and free and unafraid, just like them, just like the life they would build together on the foundation of blood and storms, and the unbreakable bonds forged in the crucible of survival. Home was waiting, and for the first time in longer than either could remember, they were eager to reach it. The stranger arrived on a Tuesday morning, 3 months after John and Eliza had settled into their new life. She was hanging laundry while John repaired fence posts when the rider appeared on the horizon, a solitary figure against the vast sky, moving with the purposeful pace of someone bearing news. "John," Eliza called, her hand moving instinctively to the rifle they kept by the door. Old habits died hard. He straightened, squinting at the approaching rider. "Just one. Doesn't look like trouble, but—" He didn't need to finish. They both knew how quickly peace could shatter. The rider was an older man, well-dressed in Eastern clothes that looked out of place in the desert. He removed his hat as he approached, revealing silver hair and kind eyes behind wire spectacles. "Mrs. McAllister, Mr. McAllister. My name is Charles Worthington. I'm a lawyer from Kansas City." He produced documents from his saddlebag. "I represent the estate of James Morrison." Eliza stiffened. "If the family has sent you—" "No, ma'am," Worthington interrupted gently. "The Morrison brothers are both in federal prison. Their assets have been seized, however, Your late husband's will, his true will, has finally been validated. You are the sole beneficiary of his personal estate, separate from the family holdings. He handed her a leather portfolio. Inside were bank documents, property deeds, and a letter in James's familiar hand. Eliza sank onto the porch steps, reading with trembling fingers. "My dearest Elizabeth," she read aloud, her voice catching. "If you are reading this, then my fears have come to pass. Know that I have taken steps to protect you from my family's greed. The enclosed documents represent accounts they know nothing about my insurance that you would be provided for should the worst occur. Live freely, my dear. You deserve nothing less." "How much?" John asked quietly, though money had never been his concern. "Sufficient to ensure you'll never want for anything," Worthington replied. "There's also a property in San Francisco, should you wish to relocate." Mr. Morrison was surprisingly thorough in his preparations. Eliza looked up, tears streaming. He knew what they were capable of and tried to protect me." "It would seem so, ma'am. I'll need your signatures on some documents, but essentially, you are now a woman of considerable means." After Worthington departed, promising to handle all legal matters, John and Eliza sat on their porch in stunned silence. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. She'd been hunted for allegedly stealing what was rightfully hers all along. "We could leave," Eliza said eventually. "Go to San Francisco. Start fresh where no one knows our story." "Is that what you want?" She looked around their small ranch at the vegetables growing in the garden she'd planted, the horses grazing in the pasture, the simple home they'd been slowly transforming with paint and care and hope. "No," she said firmly. "This is home. This is where we became us." "The money doesn't change anything," John agreed. "Though it might make things easier. Maybe hire some hands, expand the herd, fix the barn roof properly." "Build an addition," Eliza added softly, her hand moving to her still flat stomach. "For a nursery." John turned to stare at her, hope and wonder warring on his face. "Are you—" "The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday. I wanted to be sure before I told you." She bit her lip nervously. "I know it can't replace—" He pulled her into his arms, cutting off her words with a kiss that tasted of joy and tears. "A baby," he whispered against her lips. "Our baby. Are you happy?" Happy doesn't begin to cover it. He pulled back to look at her, his hands framing her face. "Though I'm also terrified. What if I'm not a good father? What if—" "Stop," Eliza commanded gently. "You're already a wonderful husband. You'll be an even better father." They were interrupted by hoofbeats, multiple riders approaching fast. John was on his feet instantly, rifle in hand, but relaxed as he recognized the lead rider. "Reverend Crenshaw," Eliza called, delighted. "What brings you here?" The old minister dismounted with surprising agility, followed by several familiar faces from Fort Davis, Lieutenant Morrison, Judge Harding, even Marshal Wallace. "We heard about Worthington's visit," Crenshaw explained. "Wanted to ensure everything was handled properly. And to bring news," Harding added. "The Morrison brothers were convicted on all counts. 20 years hard labor. Their criminal enterprise has been completely dismantled." "Justice at last," Wallace said with satisfaction. "Though I hear congratulations are also in order." He glanced meaningfully at Eliza. She blushed. "News travels fast." "In a small community, good news travels fastest." Crenshaw beamed. "I'll expect to baptize the little one when the time comes." They stayed for dinner, the small house filling with laughter and stories. Lieutenant Morrison regaled them with tales from the fort. Wallace shared news from his travels, and Harding offered legal advice on managing Eliza's inheritance. It was the kind of gathering John had never imagined having again. Friends, chosen family, people who'd stood with them through the worst and now celebrated the best. As the evening wore on, Eliza excused herself, and John found her on the porch, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. "Too much noise?" he asked, settling beside her.
No, it's wonderful. I just needed a moment to absorb it all. She leaned into him. 6 months ago, I was running for my life. Now I have a home, a husband, friends, a child growing inside me, and enough money to secure our future. It feels like a dream.
"If it is, I don't want to wake up."
John?
She turned to face him.
The money, it doesn't change how you feel.
He considered the question seriously. "It changes our circumstances, not our hearts. Though I admit, knowing our child will never want for anything, that you'll never have to run again,
that brings peace I didn't know I needed." "Our children," she corrected. "I don't intend to stop at one."
"No? I want this house full of laughter. I want chaos and noise and life. I want everything they tried to take from me. From us." Her fierce determination was tempered by vulnerability. "Is that too much?" "Nothing you want is too much," John promised. "We'll fill this house with children, expand it until it's bursting at the seams. We'll build the life we choose, not the one circumstances force on us." A sound from inside drew their attention. Reverend Crenshaw had found John's old guitar and was leading the others in song. The melody drifted through the windows, hymns mixing with folk songs in comfortable discord. "We should go back in," Eliza said, but made no move to rise. "In a moment." John pulled her closer, marveling at how natural it felt, how right. The woman who'd stumbled into Big Tom's saloon was gone, replaced by someone stronger, softer, more complete. And the man he'd been isolated, bitter, merely existing, had died somewhere between that first meeting and now. "What are you thinking?" Eliza asked. "About transformation, how the worst moments of our lives led to the best." "Providence," she murmured. "Or perhaps just the strange ways life has of working out. If James hadn't died, if his family hadn't been evil, if I hadn't run, if you hadn't been in that saloon, then we'd have lived different lives. Safer, perhaps, but not better." He kissed her forehead. "I'm grateful for every step that brought us here, painful as they were." Inside, their friends had moved from singing to storytelling, Wallace's voice carrying as he recounted some adventure from his marshalling days. The warmth and light spilling from their home made a beacon in the darkness, a declaration that life and joy could flourish even in the harsh desert. "Ready?" John asked, standing and offering his hand. "For what?" "For whatever comes next. Good times, hard times, children, challenges, all of it." Eliza took his hand, rising with the grace he'd first noticed in the saloon. "With you, I'm ready for anything." They rejoined their guests, slipping seamlessly into the conversation and laughter. But throughout the evening, John kept catching Eliza's eye, sharing secret smiles and silent communication. They'd been forged in crisis, tested by violence, and emerged stronger for it. Now they had the luxury of ordinary happiness, of planning futures instead of surviving presents. Later, after their guests had departed with promises to visit again soon, John and Eliza cleaned up together, moving in the comfortable rhythm of a couple who'd learned each other's patterns. "John," Eliza said as they prepared for bed, "do you think we'll ever tell our children the whole story about how we met, what we survived? When they're old enough to understand, they should know their parents aren't perfect, that we've made mistakes and faced darkness. But more importantly, they should know that love can bloom anywhere, even in the midst of chaos." "A romantic philosopher," she teased, but her eyes were soft. "I love you, John McAllister." "And I love you, Eliza McAllister, more than I thought possible to love again." They lay together in the darkness, her head on his shoulder, his hand resting protectively over where their child grew. Outside, coyotes called to each other across the desert, and wind whispered through the mesquite. But inside their small home, soon to be expanded, Soon to be filled with new voices, peace reigned. "Tell me about the future," Eliza murmured sleepily.
"Our children will run wild through these hills,"
John began, painting pictures with words.
"We'll teach them to ride and shoot, but also to read and dream.
You'll play piano in the evenings. We'll get one shipped from San Francisco. I'll tell terrible jokes that make everyone groan. We'll have Sunday dinners with so many people we'll need to add another table."
She was asleep before he finished, a soft smile on her face. John continued anyway, whispering dreams into the darkness. They had money now, yes, but more importantly, they had time. Time to build, to grow, to love without looking over their shoulders. Time to be ordinary in all the ways that mattered.
The woman who'd confessed to being naked, stripped of everything she'd known, was now clothed in new purpose, new identity, new love. And the man who'd nearly lost his mind holding her had found it again in the simple act of being held in return. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The ranch needed work. The pregnancy would have its difficulties, and the shadows of the past would never completely fade. But tonight, in their bed in their home with their child growing between them and their future stretching bright as desert stars, John and Eliza McAllister had everything they needed. They'd been hunted and haunted, broken and rebuilt. Now, finally, they could simply be, and in the high desert of Texas, where survival itself was an act of defiance. Being was its own quiet victory, one worth all the blood and storms that had brought them here. In her sleep, Eliza murmured his name and pressed closer. John tightened his arms around her and closed his eyes, no longer afraid of what dreams might come. The past was settled. The present was sweet, and the future, their future, was worth whatever price they'd paid to claim it. Somewhere in the darkness, an owl called, and the desert answered with silence. But in one small house on one small ranch, love answered with presence, with promise, with the quiet breathing of two souls finally, fully home. The attack came at dawn, 6 months into Eliza's pregnancy. John woke to the sound of horses, too many horses, and the instinct honed by years of survival had him reaching for his rifle before his eyes were fully open.
"Eliza,"
he whispered urgently. But she was already awake, her own hand on the pistol they kept by the bedside. Through the window, they could see riders surrounding the house, at least a dozen men, all armed, all wearing the kind of clothes that spoke of money and Eastern origins. At their head sat a man John had never seen before, but whose resemblance to the imprisoned Morrison brothers was unmistakable.
"Patrick Morrison,"
Eliza breathed, her face paling. "James's cousin. I thought he was in Europe." "Apparently he's back," John said grimly, checking his ammunition. "Stay low. If shooting starts..." "Mrs. Morrison." The voice from outside was cultured, reasonable, terrifying in its calm. Or should I say, Mrs. McAllister. "I believe we need to discuss family business." "We've got nothing to discuss." John called back, positioning himself at the window. "You're trespassing on private property." "Property purchased with Morrison money," Patrick replied smoothly. "But I'm not here for violence. Mr. McAllister, I'm here to make a generous offer. May I come in alone?" "Of course." John and Eliza exchanged glances. Refusing would likely trigger the violence they wanted to avoid, especially with Eliza in her condition. But letting a Morrison into their home... "He comes in unarmed," John finally said. "Your men stay where they are."
"Agreed."
Minutes later, Patrick Morrison sat at their kitchen table, looking incongruously civilized for a man who'd brought a small army to their door. He was younger than his cousins, perhaps 40, with intelligent eyes and an unsettling smile. "Coffee," Eliza offered, her voice steady despite the circumstances. "How gracious. Yes, thank you." He studied her as she moved, his gaze lingering on her swollen belly. "Pregnancy suits you. Elizabeth, James would be pleased to know his widow found happiness again." "State your business." John cut in, not liking the way Morrison looked at his wife.
Direct. I appreciate that. Patrick accepted the coffee cup with manicured hands.
I've spent considerable resources cleaning up my cousin's mess. Bad for the family name. You understand. But in reviewing their activities, I discovered some interesting facts. He produced a leather folder, spreading documents on the table. The money dear Elizabeth inherited, it seems James was quite creative in hiding assets from the family, money that, legally speaking, should have remained in Morrison control.
The courts validated the will, Eliza said coldly.
Provincial courts, small-town judges?
Patrick waved dismissively.
I have lawyers who could tie up your inheritance for years, possibly decades. Your child would be grown before you saw a penny.
So you're here to threaten us, John stated flatly. Quite the opposite. I'm here to make you wealthy beyond imagining. Patrick leaned back, supremely confident. I want the Morrison name cleared of scandal. You two are the last reminder of my cousin's failure. So here's my offer, $50,000 cash, clear title to this ranch, and guaranteed safety for your family. In exchange, you sign documents relinquishing all claims to James's estate and agree to relocate California, perhaps, or even Europe.
And if we refuse, Eliza asked. Patrick's civilized mask slipped briefly, revealing something cold underneath. Then I'll use every resource at my disposal to destroy you. Legally, of course. Tied up in court. You'll bankrupt yourselves fighting me. Your child will grow up in poverty while lawyers feast on what should be yours. He smiled again. Or you take my generous offer and live comfortable lives far from here.
John felt Eliza's hand find his under the table, squeezing tight. He knew what she was thinking. They'd fought so hard for their freedom, their home, their life together, to be driven away now, when they'd finally found peace.
We need time to consider, Eliza said carefully.
Of course. 24 hours should be sufficient. Patrick stood, straightening his coat. I'll return tomorrow for your answer. Do think carefully. Your child's future depends on your decision. After he left, taking his men with him, John and Eliza sat in heavy silence. The coffee grew cold between them as they grappled with an impossible choice.
Maybe we should take it, Eliza finally said, her voice small. $50,000. Safety for our child.
You don't mean that.
Don't I?
She stood abruptly, pacing despite her condition.
I'm so tired of fighting. John, every time we think we're free, another Morrison appears. What if he's right? What if we spend years in court, losing everything?
John caught her hands, stilling her restless movement.
Look at me. Is money worth our home, worth letting them drive us away from the life we've built? It's not about the money, she said, tears flowing freely now. It's about our baby. What kind of mother puts her child at risk for the sake of pride?
What kind of parents teach their child to run from bullies? John countered.
To give up what's right because fighting is hard. They were interrupted by approaching hoofbeats, a single rider this time. John grabbed his rifle again, but relaxed as he recognized the rider, Miguel Delgado, their friend and nearest neighbor.
Señor John, Señora Miguel dismounted quickly.
I bring news from town. Many men arrive, asking questions about you, and this, he produced a telegram, from Marshal Wallace. He says to tell you, remember the Alamo. John read the brief message, a smile slowly spreading across his face. Patrick Morrison made one mistake. He assumed we were alone. What do you mean? Eliza asked. Wallace has been investigating the Morrison family's European connections. Seems Cousin Patrick isn't as clean as he pretends. John showed her the telegram. Federal warrants issued, marshals on the way. All we have to do is keep Patrick here long enough. A trap, Eliza breathed. But his men... We'll scatter when the federales arrive, Miguel interjected. Hired guns have no loyalty when badges appear, but you must survive until then. No, they spent the day preparing. John and Miguel fortified defensive positions while Eliza, despite protests about her condition, organized supplies, and loaded weapons. As the sun began to sink, she found John on the porch, staring at the horizon. "Worried?" she asked, settling beside him with some difficulty. "Always. When it comes to you." He pulled her close. "I keep thinking about that night in the canyon, when you told me you were naked, stripped of everything. Remember? How could I forget you held me while I fell apart?" "You weren't falling apart," John corrected. "You were becoming like a snake shedding old skin, painful but necessary." He touched her belly gently. "And look what's grown from that becoming." "A family," she whispered. "Our family." "Worth fighting for." "Worth everything," she affirmed, steel returning to her voice. "Patrick Morrison thinks we're just two people he can intimidate. He's about to learn differently." That night, they barely slept. Every sound might herald attack. Every shadow could hide threat. But when dawn came, it brought not violence, but opportunity. A dust cloud on the eastern horizon announced riders too many to be Morrison's men alone. "The marshals," Eliza hoped. "Wrong direction," John said grimly. "But not Morrison either. Look, that's a cavalry pennant." Indeed, as the riders approached, they could see military precision in their movement. Leading them was a familiar face, Lieutenant Morrison, now wearing captain's insignia. "McAllister, Mrs. McAllister," he called. "Heard you might need assistance. My patrol was in the area." "Since when does the cavalry involve itself in civilian matters?" John asked, though he was grateful for the support. "Since federal marshals requested backup for arresting a suspected international criminal," Morrison replied with a grin. "Patrick Morrison's wanted for smuggling, among other things. My orders are to ensure he doesn't escape across the border." They didn't have long to wait. Patrick arrived precisely at the appointed hour, his hired guns spreading out with practiced efficiency. He walked toward the house with supreme confidence, clearly expecting capitulation. That confidence faltered when he saw Captain Morrison in full uniform standing beside John and Eliza. "What is this?" Patrick demanded. "Justice," Marshal Wallace said, appearing from behind the barn with 4 other federal marshals. "Patrick Morrison, you're under arrest for smuggling, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit fraud." Patrick's face went white, then red with rage. "You set me up," he snarled at Eliza. "You worthless." His words cut off as John's fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling in the dust. "Watch how you speak to my wife," John said calmly. The arrest happened quickly after that. Patrick's hired men, faced with federal badges and cavalry rifles, surrendered without resistance. As the marshals led Patrick away in irons, he turned back one last time. "This isn't over," he spat. "The Morrison name." "Is finished," Eliza interrupted, standing tall despite her pregnancy. "Your cousins are in prison. You're joining them, and the family fortune built on intimidation and crime is gone. James would be appalled at what you've become." Wallace approached as the prisoners were loaded onto a prison wagon. "Clean sweep," he said with satisfaction. "With Patrick's arrest, the last of the Morrison criminal empire falls. You're truly free now." "How can we thank you?" Eliza asked. "Live well," Wallace said simply. "Raise that child in peace. That's thanks enough." As the various lawmen departed, John and Eliza stood together on their porch, watching dust clouds fade into distance. The ranch felt different somehow, not just safe, but truly theirs for the first time. "It's over," Eliza said wonderingly. "Really, truly over." "The fighting is," John agreed. "Now comes the harder part, living without looking over our shoulders." She laughed, a sound bright as morning. "I think we can manage that." Miguel rode up, having watched the arrest with obvious enjoyment. Senora, shall I spread word in town? People will want to celebrate." "Let them know," John decided. "In fact, tell them we're hosting a barbecue next Sunday. Time we stopped being hermits and started being neighbors. As Miguel rode off with the news, Eliza turned to her husband with mock severity. A barbecue, do you know how much work that is? And me, in this condition? I'll do the work, John promised. You just sit and be admired. Admired? She looked down at her swollen form dubiously. Beloved, he amended, kissing her soundly. By me, by our friends, by everyone who knows what you've survived to get here. They spent the rest of the day in quiet celebration, planning their party, discussing the future without the shadow of pursuit hanging over them. As evening fell, they sat together watching the sunset paint the desert in brilliant colors.
John, Eliza said softly, that night in the canyon, when I said I was naked, I was wrong.
Oh, I wasn't stripped of everything. I still had courage, still had hope, still had the capacity to love. She took his hand, placing it over their child.
I just couldn't see it until you showed me.
The baby kicked beneath their joined hands, and John felt his heart swell with emotions he'd thought lost forever. They'd won more than just freedom from the Morrisons. They'd won the right to be ordinary, to worry about barbecues and nursery colors instead of survival. No more looking back, Eliza declared. From now on, only forward. Forward, John agreed, pulling her close as stars began to appear overhead. In the distance, a mockingbird began its evening song, running through its repertoire of borrowed melodies. John thought it fitting they too had taken pieces of their broken pasts and made something new, something beautiful, something entirely their own. The war was over. Let the peace begin. The barbecue drew half the county, wagons and riders arriving from dawn onward. John watched from the porch as their quiet ranch transformed into a gathering place. Children running between tables while adults shared food and stories. At the center of it all was Eliza, radiant despite being days from delivery, orchestrating the chaos with grace. Never thought I'd see the day. Big Tom rumbled, joining John with 2 cups of coffee. John McAllister playing host to half of Texas. Things change, John replied, unable to keep the smile from his face as he watched Eliza directing Mary and other women in setting up food tables. That they do. That woman of yours, she's changed everything about you. Tom's expression grew serious. Sarah would be glad, glad you found your way back to living. Before John could respond, a commotion near the road drew attention. A lone rider approached, moving fast, dust billowing behind. As the figure grew closer, John recognized Reverend Crenshaw. His usually composed face creased with urgency.
John Mrs.
McAllister. The Reverend barely waited for his horse to stop before dismounting.
The baby, is the baby born yet?
Not yet, Eliza said, waddling over despite John's protests. She should rest.
What's wrong, Reverend?
Nothing wrong. Child. Something miraculous. He produced a letter from his coat, hands shaking with excitement. This came from a lawyer in Philadelphia. It seems James Morrison had a great-aunt Constance Morrison. She died last month at 93, and she's left her entire estate to you. Eliza sank onto the nearest bench, face pale.
I don't understand. I never met any of James's extended family.
Apparently, she'd been estranged from the family for decades, disagreed with their business practices. She followed your trial from afar, was impressed by your courage. Crenshaw handed over the letter. She wrote that you represented what the Morrison name should have stood for: integrity, strength, compassion. The estate is considerable. How considerable? John asked, steadying Eliza with a hand on her shoulder. Nearly $200,000, plus properties in Philadelphia and Boston. A hush fell over the gathered crowd. Such wealth was beyond imagination for most present. Eliza looked up at John, eyes wide with shock. We could, she started, then stopped, her hand going to her belly. Her face changed, tightening with sudden pain. Oh, John. The baby, He was beside her instantly. I think, yes, it's time. What followed was organized chaos. The women took charge, shooing men away while transforming their bedroom into a birthing chamber. John paced outside, wearing a track in the porch boards while friends tried to distract him with conversation and whiskey. First baby's always the longest, Captain Morrison offered, having arrived for the barbecue just in time for the excitement. My wife was in labor 18 hours with our eldest. Not helpful, Wallace commented dryly, watching John's face drain of color. Hours passed. The sun began its descent, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The barbecue continued in subdued fashion, neighbors staying to offer support. Then, just as the first stars appeared, a new sound split the air, the powerful cry of a newborn. Mary appeared at the door, beaming. "Mr. McAllister, you have a daughter." John's knees nearly buckled. A daughter as she is Eliza. "Both perfect. Come meet your little girl." The room was warm with lamplight and the earthy smell of new life. Eliza lay propped against pillows, exhausted but glowing, cradling a tiny bundle. When she looked up at John, her face shone with joy and tears. "Come meet Sarah," she whispered. John froze. "Sarah? If that's all right, I thought—" Eliza's voice was tentative. "She should carry the name forward. Sarah Hope McAllister, for the past we honor and the future we're building." John sank onto the bed beside them, his large hands trembling as he touched his daughter's impossibly small fingers. The baby's eyes opened blue like her mother's and seemed to look straight into his soul. "She's perfect," he breathed, tears flowing freely. "Both of you perfect." They sat in quiet wonder until whooping from outside announced the crowd's celebration of the news. Soon, friends filed through to offer congratulations and glimpses of the newest McAllister. Born into wealth and love. Reverend Crenshaw observed, "Blessing the child, may she know only the latter's true value." As the evening wore on and guests began departing, John and Eliza found themselves alone with their daughter. The weight of the day's revelations, the inheritance, the birth settled around them like a comfortable blanket. "What do we do with so much money?" Eliza asked, adjusting Sarah's swaddling. "Whatever we want," John replied, still marveling at his daughter's tiny features. "Though I can't imagine wanting more than this." "A school," Eliza said suddenly. "James always talked about education being the key to progress. We could build a proper school for the area, bring in real teachers." "A hospital too," John added, warming to the idea. "So women don't have to rely on midwives and prayer alone. Look at us, planning to change the world." Eliza smiled softly. "Yesterday we were just trying to survive." "We're still those people," John reminded her, "just with more resources and something more precious to protect." Sarah made a small sound, not quite a cry, and John picked her up with careful reverence. She settled against his chest, and he felt his heart rearrange itself around this tiny being. "I'm going to tell you stories," he whispered to his daughter, "about your brave mama who walked out of the desert, about the friends who stood by us, about your namesake who watches over you from heaven." His voice caught. "About how love finds a way, even in the hardest ground." A knock interrupted the moment. Miguel peered around the door, hat in hand. "Pardon, but there's one more visitor. Says he must see the señora tonight." The visitor was a young woman, travel-worn and nervous. She clutched a carpet bag and bore the unmistakable look of someone running from something. "Mrs. McAllister," she said hesitantly. "I'm Catherine Winters. I heard, that is, people say you help women in trouble." Eliza and John exchanged glances. They'd never advertised such a thing, but apparently their story had spread, taking on its own life. "What kind of trouble?" Eliza asked gently. "My husband, he's not a good man. I need to get away, start over, but I don't know how. When I heard about you, how you escaped, Catherine's voice broke.
I have nowhere else to turn.
You have somewhere now, Eliza said firmly.
John, can you have Miguel prepare the guest room?
She turned back to Catherine. You're safe here. Tomorrow, we'll discuss your options. Tonight, you rest. After Catherine was settled, John returned to find Eliza nursing Sarah, a thoughtful expression on her face. This won't be the last one, she said. Women seeking help, Probably not. John agreed. How do you feel about that? Like it's meant to be. We have resources now. Money, connections, understanding of what it's like to be hunted. She looked down at their daughter. I want Sarah to grow up in a world where women have choices, where they don't have to run into the desert to find freedom. The Elizabeth Morrison Foundation. John suggested. Or would you prefer the Eliza McAllister Foundation? How about just the Haven? Eliza smiled. A place of safety in the storm. I like it. John kissed her forehead, then Sarah's. Our daughter's going to grow up watching her mother change the world. Her father, too, Eliza corrected. The man who stands guard while others rebuild their lives. They talked long into the night, planning a future that would have seemed impossible just years before. A school for local children, medical facilities for the community, a network of safe houses for women escaping dangerous situations. The Morrison inheritance would fund it all, a final irony that James's family's wealth would ultimately serve the very people they'd oppressed. As dawn approached, painting the desert in soft pastels, John stood at the window holding his sleeping daughter. The ranch spread before him, no longer just a hiding place, but a foundation for something larger. In the growing light, he could almost see it: children running to their new school, women finding shelter and hope, a community growing strong together. What are you thinking? Eliza asked, joining him at the window. About circles. John replied. How we ran in circles trying to escape the past, only to find ourselves exactly where we need to be. Home. Eliza agreed, leaning into him. Not just a place, but a purpose. Sarah stirred in his arms, making small sounds of contentment, looking down at her. John saw not just his daughter, but all the daughters who would benefit from what they were building. The haven they'd create wouldn't just shelter bodies, it would nurture spirits, educate minds, and prove that even in the harshest desert, hope could bloom. She'll never know hunger or fear, John murmured. Never have to run, never have to hide who she is. She'll know other things, Eliza added. Compassion, purpose, the joy of helping others stand tall. The sun cleared the horizon, flooding their home with golden light, somewhere in the house. Catherine Winters slept safely for perhaps the first time in years. In town, people would wake to news of the McAllister baby and the plans for a school. The future stretched before them, bright with possibility. No more looking back, John asked, echoing Eliza's words from days before. Oh, we'll look back, Eliza corrected, smiling. But only to remember how far we've come, and to teach Sarah that every ending can be a beginning, if you're brave enough to turn the page. John pulled his family close, his wife who'd walked through fire to find freedom, his daughter born into a legacy of courage, and the promise of all the lives they'd touch. The desert wind whispered through the windows, no longer carrying threats, but possibilities. They'd started with violence and flight, with a desperate woman stumbling into a saloon and a broken man choosing to care again. They'd survived pursuit and prejudice, bullets and betrayal. Now, as the new day dawned, they stood ready to build something lasting from the ashes of what they'd escaped. The woman who'd confessed to being naked, stripped of everything, was now clothed in purpose and surrounded by love. The cowboy who'd taken her into his arms had found his heart again. And their daughter, Sarah Hope McAllister, would grow up knowing that sometimes the greatest adventures begin with the simplest acts of courage, like choosing to help a stranger, or refusing to let fear win, or daring to love after loss. Outside, A roadrunner called its morning greeting, and life stirred across the ranch. There was work to do, a school to build, a haven to establish, a daughter to raise. But for this moment, John and Eliza stood together at their window, watching the sun rise on their first day as a complete family. The end of their desperate flight had become the beginning of something far greater. And in the vast Texas desert, where survival itself was a victory, they'd managed something even more remarkable. They'd found a way to thrive. "Ready for the next chapter?" John asked. "With you," Eliza turned in his arms, careful not to wake Sarah. "Always." The sun climbed higher, blessing their ranch, their dreams, and their future with light. And somewhere in the distance, carried on the desert wind, came the sound of children laughing, not yet real, but a promise of what would be. The McAllister Ranch was no longer just a home. It was a beginning. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're listening from. Please share in the comments below so we can connect and discuss your thoughts about John and Eliza's journey. If you enjoyed this Wild West love story, please subscribe to my channel Wild West Night. Give this video a like. And don't forget to hit the hype button to help more people discover this tale of courage, love, and redemption in the American frontier.